Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly back in time, not to a land of fairy tales and noble knights, but to the cold, hard stone of medieval castles, where the tapestries are heavy with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else. Something a little metallic, a little unsettling. Imagine you're there, a flickering torch, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. The silence of the night is broken only by the distant howl of a wolf, or perhaps the not-so-distant creak of a dungeon door. You can almost feel the chill seeping up from the flagstones, a chill that has little to do with the night air. It's the kind of place where the person in charge, the one draped in furs and jewels, might just decide your fate on a whim, and not always in a let's have more cake kind of way. Honestly, if you were suddenly dropped into one of these courts with your 21st century sensibilities and expectations of, say, basic human rights, you probably wouldn't survive the first week. Or the first royal dinner, depending on the menu and the monarch's mood. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really does help the channel, and it lets me know you appreciate these little dives into the darker corners of history. And hey, while you're at it, why not drop your location and local time in the comments below? It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in, from creating our own little global historical society huddled around the digital campfire. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing in the shadows of a vast stone hall. Royalty. The word itself shimmers, doesn't it? It conjures images of glittering crowns, majestic processions, and a certain effortless command. Power. That's the potent, often invisible force that shapes kingdoms and decides destinies, the very air the royals breathe. Glory. Ah, glory. The triumphant parades, the epic poems sung in your honor, the kind of legacy that makes people name their children, or perhaps their prize-winning ferrets after you centuries later. And then sometimes lurking just beneath the ermine and silk, you find, well, let's just say some personalities that wouldn't pass muster in a modern HR department. We're talking about full-blown sociopathy in some rather unfortunate cases, wrapped in purple robes and given a scepter. Tonight we're taking that quiet stroll, as promised, not through a manicured palace garden, but through the rather more blood-soaked thrones of history's most unsettlingly brutal medieval kings. Imagine the weight of a crown, not just its physical heaviness, with all those rather pointy jewels, but the metaphorical weight. In the medieval world, a king wasn't just a head of state, he was often the state itself. His moods could alter trade policies, his indigestion could spark a border skirmish, his fleeting paranoia could mean a very bad day for anyone whose name was whispered too loudly in the corridors. This unchecked authority often leaned on the burgeoning idea of being God's chosen, a sort of early draft of the divine right of kings, where questioning the monarch was like questioning the heavens themselves. A celestial get-out-of-jail-free card for some truly earthly misdeeds, you might say. If the king declared that, say, Tuesdays were henceforth dedicated to mandatory interpretive dance in the village square, you'd better start stretching. Objecting wasn't really on the medieval peasant's to-do list, nestled somewhere between find edible mushroom and avoid plague. The air you breathe in these halls is thick with more than just the smoke from the great hearth. It's thick with ambition, intrigue, and a pervasive unspoken fear. You see, the medieval court was a complex ecosystem of power. Nobles jostled for favor, hoping for a scrap of influence, a title, or just to keep their heads attached to their necks. And the king, perched at the apex of this precarious structure, often maintained his position, not just through wisdom or benevolence, but through a very clear, very sharp-edged demonstration of what happened to those who crossed him. It's a management style that's thankfully fallen out of favor mostly. Think about the stories that have trickled down to us, the ones that aren't all knights in shining armor and damsels in distress. Historians still argue whether the veneer of chivalry and courtly love, so popular in songs and stories, was a genuine attempt to civilize a brutal age, or merely a pretty distraction, while the powerful did pretty much whatever they pleased. Was Sir Lancelot really spending his off hours composing sonnets, or was he just trying to remember where he parked his warhorse without getting on the king's bad side? The truth, as always, is probably a messy, uncomfortable blend. The glory we mentioned earlier. It was often measured in conquered lands, defeated enemies, and the sheer, unadulterated fear a king could instill. The chronicles of the time, often written by monks who were, shall we say, encouraged to find the king's best angle, still can't quite hide the brutality. Between the lines praising a king's piety or strategic genius, you find hints of massacres of ruthlessly suppressed rebellions of justice that was swift, terrible, and very, very public. These weren't just footnotes. They were the bedrock of power for some of these rulers. Their thrones weren't just made of wood and gold. They were cemented with the fear of their subjects and the bones of their enemies. It's a rather grim interior design choice, but apparently it had a certain intimidating appeal. And it wasn't just the high-profile enemies who had to worry. The life of a commoner, already a relentless struggle against famine, disease, and the elements, could be made infinitely worse by a cruel or capricious monarch. A king's decision to go to war meant your sons conscripted, your meager crops requisitioned. A king's desire for a new, grander castle meant backbreaking labor and crushing taxes. You are tilling your small patch of uncooperative land, hoping the rain comes at the right time, and the blight stays away. And then a royal decree arrives, demanding more grain than you've ever seen in one place, because the king has a new building project or a new feud with a neighboring lord. What do? There's no customer service line to call, no ombudsman to appeal to. There's just the king's will and the heavily armed men who enforce it. Even those within the castle walls weren't entirely safe. Imagine the pressure on the royal food taster. A position of some considerable honor, believe it or not. Every meal a potential game of Russian roulette, but with soup. One wrong bite, one disgruntled chef, or one overly ambitious cousin of the king, and your distinguished career in gastronomy could come to a very sudden, very final end. Even the court jester, whose job it was to speak truth to power under the guise of humor, had to tread an incredibly fine line. One joke that landed badly with a king who had a particularly thin skin or a penchant for creative punishments, and the laughter would die very quickly indeed. It's hard to be witty when you're worried your next punchline might involve a thumbscrew. So as we prepare to meet some of these medieval monarchs up close, remember that the stories are not just abstract historical accounts. They are about real power wielded by real people with very real and often very brutal consequences. The psychological landscape of the era was shaped by this ever-present potential for royal wrath. You're not just trying to survive the harshness of the medieval world itself. You're navigating a world where the ultimate authority might be a figure of immense power and sometimes terrifying caprice. The shadows in these castles are long, and they often hide more than just dust and cobwebs. They hide the whispers of those who pleased the king and the chilling silence of those who did not. We're about to step into some of those deeper shadows now to look at reigns where the crown cast a particularly dark and fearsome umbra. And one of the deepest, most chillingly memorable of these umbras was cast from the rugged forested lands of Wallachia, a region that today forms part of Romania. You feel the air grow colder here, the scent of pine sharp in your nostrils, mixed with something else. An undertone of old fear so potent, it's almost a physical presence. Our host for this part of the journey is a man whose name has become synonymous with a particularly gruesome form of justice, a ruler so formidable that his legend would eventually morph into one of the most enduring monsters of popular culture. We are, of course, speaking of Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, better known to a trembling world as Vlad the Impaler. Now before your mind immediately conjures images of bats' capes and a rather specific aversion to garlic, let's gently separate the man from the myth. The Dracula you know from novels and films is largely a creation of the 19th century, a Gothic masterpiece spun by Bram Stoker. But Stoker borrowed the name, Dracula, meaning son of the dragon, as Vlad's father was Vlad II, Dracul, a member of the Order of the Dragon, and he certainly tapped into the genuine historical reputation for ruthlessness that clung to the real Prince of Wallachia. You see him then, not as a creature of the night, but as a very real, very human ruler in the turbulent 15th century, a time when survival for a small principality like Wallachia squeezed between the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary was a constant bloody struggle. Vlad's primary claim to historical fame, and the source of his rather pointed nickname, was his enthusiastic and systematic use of impalement. His methods of ensuring civic order and discouraging his enemies weren't exactly what you'd find in a How to Win Friends and Influence People seminar, medieval edition, or otherwise. For Vlad, this wasn't just a means of execution. It was a form of psychological warfare, a gruesome spectacle designed to inspire absolute terror and obedience. You have to imagine what it communicated. This wasn't a quick death. Victims were by most accounts hoisted onto sharpened stakes, often rounded not too sharp to prolong the agony, ensuring they died slowly, sometimes over days, from exposure shock and internal injuries. It's said he orchestrated these scenes with a chilling precision, arranging the stakes in geometric patterns, sometimes varying the height according to the rank of the victim. This is where that grim phrase you might have heard, a physical symphony, seems to find its unnerving root. Not a symphony of sound, but a visual orchestra of dread, each silent suffering figure, a note in a composition of ultimate power and warning. You can almost picture him observing, not with overt glee, perhaps, but with the satisfaction of a grim artist who has made his point unequivocally. The sheer theatricality of it was meant to paralyze his foes and subjects alike with fear. One of the most infamous tales. And with Vlad, it's often hard to untangle verifiable fact from embellished legend. Involves the Forest of the Impaled. As the story goes, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, invaded Wallachia with a massive army, he was met not by a defending force, but by a horrifying vista. Thousands upon thousands of impaled Turkish prisoners and his own soldiers, a rotting silent army lining the road to Vlad's capital, Târgoviște. His approach to landscape gardening was, shall we say, unique, often involving large-scale installations of his enemies. Not exactly cheerful, but it certainly sent a message to any invading army looking for a picnic spot. The Sultan, a hardened warrior himself, was reportedly so sickened and unnerved by the sight that he turned his army around. True or not in its exaggerated scale, the story illustrates the kind of reputation Vlad cultivated. Yet within Wallachia itself, his justice, though brutal, was also sometimes lauded for being impartial, at least according to some chronicles. He targeted corrupt boyars, nobles, opportunistic merchants, and common criminals with equal ferocity. There's a famous story that to demonstrate the honesty he had enforced in his realm, Vlad placed a golden cup in the main square of Trgoviste. Anyone could drink from it, but it was never to be moved. Throughout his reign, the cup remained untouched. Apparently, the potential consequences far outweighed any thirst for gold, a surprisingly effective, if somewhat terrifying, anti-theft device. It makes you wonder about the crime rates, doesn't it? Probably quite low for purse snatching, very high for, well, an agonizing death on a stick. Vlad's reign, spanning several periods in the mid-1400s, was indeed marked by his fierce campaigns to maintain Wallachian independence against the far larger and more powerful Ottoman Empire, a significant mainstream historical fact often overshadowed by his gruesome fame. He was in many ways a product of a brutal era, a commander who employed the terror tactics he believed were necessary not only to secure his own rule, but also to protect his people from Ottoman incursions. This is where the image of Vlad becomes more complex than that of a simple monster. Historians still argue whether Vlad's almost theatrical brutality was primarily a calculated deterrent, a grim necessity in a tiny principality squeezed between powerful empires, or if there was a darker, more personal satisfaction in the meticulous application of such agonizing punishments. Was he a patriot employing extreme measures in desperate times? Or was there a genuine sadistic streak that found an outlet in his methods of rule? The truth likely lies somewhere in that uncomfortable gray area, a place where statecraft and personal cruelty could become indistinguishable. For Romanians, particularly in later centuries, when nationalist sentiments rose, Vlad has sometimes been reclaimed as a national hero, a stern but just ruler who defended their land against foreign invaders and cleaned up internal corruption. It's a stark contrast to the bloodthirsty tyrant of popular Western imagination, or the suave, caped vampire he unwillingly fathered in fiction. You find statues of him in Romania that don't depict him with fangs, but as a resolute leader and warrior. It's a reminder that history is often a matter of perspective, and a villain in one narrative can be a hero in another. So as you picture this landscape of Wallachia under Vlad's rule, it's not just the physical stakes you should imagine, but the psychological ones too. The constant awareness of that absolute unmerciful power. The knowledge that any transgression, real or perceived, could lead to an unimaginably horrific end. It's a stark illustration of how one individual's will, backed by sufficient ruthlessness, could define the entire reality of a nation, casting a long pointed shadow that stretches even into our nightmares today. The quiet rustle of the leaves in the Wallachian forests around you might just carry the faintest echoes of those chilling times, a whisper of the Impaler's terrible peace. From those dark, stake-lined forests of the east, our quiet path now leads us westward across the plains and forests of medieval Europe until you feel the damp, misty air of England settling around you. The chill here is less overtly menacing than in Vlad's domain, perhaps, but it's a deeper, more insidious cold that seeps into your bones. The chill of a kingdom simmering with discontent, ruled by a king whose legacy is so consistently tarnished. He's become the quintessential bad king in the popular imagination. You're now treading the muddy tracks of Angevin England, and the sovereign in question is King John. Now, John wasn't known for the kind of flamboyant, large-scale impalements that made Vlad a household name in horror. His brand of cruelty was often more personal, more insidious, and for those who crossed him, utterly devastating. He was the youngest son of the formidable Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and brother to the famously heroic Richard the Lionheart. You can imagine those family dinners were probably a masterclass in passive aggression and strategic sighing, especially after John tried to usurp Richard's throne while he was off on crusade. Holiday gatherings must have been a real treat. When John finally did become king in 1199, he inherited a vast but unwieldy empire and a treasury depleted by Richard's crusading adventures. It was a tough gig, no doubt, but John's own character didn't exactly help matters. Contemporary chroniclers, and it's fair to say many of them weren't exactly in his fan club, painted him as suspicious, petty, avaricious, and deeply untrustworthy. Many of these accounts were penned by monastic chroniclers who weren't exactly his biggest fans, often because he'd taxed their monasteries to within an inch of their vellum. So you might say he had a bit of a PR problem with the medieval equivalent of the influential media. Yet, even allowing for some bias, the sheer volume of accusations about his conduct is telling. One of the most chilling aspects of his reign was his treatment of hostages and prisoners. In an age where taking hostages from noble families was a common political tool, John seemed to take a particularly grim satisfaction in their suffering. You hear whispers in the cold corridors of Windsor Castle, tales of those who fell from favor. Perhaps the most infamous example is the fate of Matilda de Braouse and her eldest son William. Matilda was the wife of a powerful baron, William de Braouse, who had once been a royal favorite, but later fell foul of John's suspicions and mounting debts. When de Braouse fled, John, in a fit of vindictive fury, captured Matilda and her son. The story goes that he had them imprisoned and deliberately starved to death. Imagine their slow, agonizing end, a direct result of the king's personal vendetta. It's this kind of calculated, cold-hearted cruelty that cemented his reputation as inhuman. You wouldn't just be defeated by John, you could be slowly, deliberately erased. His reign was also marked by a series of political and military failures. He lost the Duchy of Normandy and most of his other French possessions to King Philip II of France, earning him the rather unfortunate nickname John Softsword. These losses weren't just blows to his prestige. They were blows to the pockets of his barons, many of whom held estates in those territories. Add to this his bitter dispute with Pope Innocent III, which led to England being placed under an interdict for 6 years, meaning no church services, no baptisms in churches, no Christian burials. For the deeply religious populace of the time, this was a spiritual catastrophe, and it did little to endear John to his people or the powerful clergy. To fund his failing wars and his lavish lifestyle, John squeezed his kingdom dry with relentless taxation. He exploited feudal dues to their absolute limit-levied scutage money, paid in lieu of military service at unprecedented rates, and imposed arbitrary fines. If you were a baron, you felt this pressure directly. If you were a merchant, your goods were taxed heavily. If you were a peasant, well, you were at the bottom of the pile, and everything eventually rolled downhill. The discontent wasn't just among the elite. It was a pervasive sense of being under the thumb of a grasping, unpredictable, and often cruel ruler. You can almost feel the rising tide of frustration, the whispered conversations in alehouses and manors, the growing sense that something had to give, and give it eventually did. The English barons, pushed to their limits by John's abuses of power, his financial demands, and his untrustworthiness, finally rose in rebellion. This wasn't just a few disgruntled nobles. It was a significant portion of the kingdom's power players. They weren't asking for a new king initially. They were demanding that John himself abide by the established customs and laws of the land. The Magna Carta, the Great Charter, which King John was famously forced to seal at Runnymede in June 1215, was the direct result of this baronial uprising. This is, of course, a mainstream historical fact of monumental importance. The Magna Carta was essentially the barons saying, "Look, Your Majesty, we need to set some ground rules here, because your current style of my way or the highway, and the highway is probably booby-trapped, isn't working for us." It was the medieval world's most consequential, strongly worded letter, backed up by a lot of very pointy swords. While the Magna Carta, in its original form, was primarily concerned with protecting the rights and privileges of the nobility, and John himself had no real intention of upholding it, leading to the First Barons' War. Its symbolic power was immense. It established the principle that even the king was subject to the law, a revolutionary concept at the time. You can see it as a landmark on the long, slow road towards constitutional government. Yet the question lingers, and historians still argue whether King John was truly as incompetent and malevolent as contemporary chroniclers portrayed him, or if he was a reasonably capable, if unlucky ruler, struggling against an almost impossible set of financial and political circumstances, compounded by a very effective smear campaign by those he'd alienated. Perhaps he was just a man of his time, albeit one with a particularly nasty streak, ruling in an era where royal power was often arbitrary and harsh. To add a final, almost comically unfortunate flourish to his reign, John famously managed to lose his baggage train, which included the crown jewels in an estuary called the Wash in 1216. 1 minute, you're a king with all your bling and your royal treasure. The next minute, it's all sinking into tidal mud flats, thanks to a misjudged crossing. A fittingly disastrous event for a reign plagued by misfortune and misjudgment, really. Like history's way of saying, and another thing. He died shortly thereafter, not in glorious battle, but of dysentery, his kingdom still embroiled in civil war. So as you drift away from the damp fields of Runnymede, leaving King John to his unenviable legacy, you carry with you the knowledge that even the most absolute power can be challenged. The story of John, for all its cruelty and failure, ends with a glimmer of hope. Not for him, perhaps, but for the idea that rulers could and should be accountable. The chill you feel now might be tempered with the faintest warmth from that distant spark of a new idea that no one, not even a king, should be above the law. That spark, ignited by the muddy fields of Runnymede, would flicker and grow over centuries. But our path for now leads us away from the dawning idea of legal restraint and into the heart of a domain ruled by a man who seemed to embody the zenith of unchecked knightly ambition, a ruler whose personal code of honor often translated into pitiless action on a grand scale. You find yourself now amidst the rich tapestries and glittering wealth of the Duchy of Burgundy in the latter half of the 15th century. Your host, Duke Charles, known to history with a mixture of admiration and trepidation as Le Téméraire, Charles the Bold, or perhaps more tellingly, Charles the Rash. The Duchy of Burgundy under Charles was no mere backwater. Imagine a powerful state, a vibrant tapestry of lands stretching across what is now parts of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. It was a center of immense wealth culture and artistic patronage. The Burgundian court was legendary for its opulence, its elaborate feasts, its chivalric orders, like the prestigious Order of the Golden Fleece. You can almost hear the rustle of silk and velvet, the murmur of French, spoken with courtly precision, the distant strains of a minstrel's lute. Charles himself was a product of this environment, educated, cultured, deeply pious, and possessed of an almost fanatical devotion to the ideals of knighthood. But Charles wasn't content with just being a duke, even a super rich and powerful one. He was aiming for a crown, the kind you couldn't just buy from the medieval equivalent of a party store. His great ambition was to elevate Burgundy from a collection of duchies and counties into a unified independent kingdom, a new middle kingdom between France and the Holy Roman Empire, with himself as its first king. This burning ambition, coupled with his rigid sense of honor, propelled him into a series of ruthless military campaigns. If a town or a territory defied him or stood in the way of his grand vision, his response was often swift and terrifyingly brutal. You witness the smoke rising in the distance, the grim determination in the eyes of his soldiers. Consider the fate of Dinant, a town in what is now Belgium. In 1466, after the townsfolk had allegedly insulted him and his family, Charles unleashed his fury. The town was sacked, burned, and it's said that hundreds of its citizens were tied together and drowned in the River Meuse. This wasn't just warfare. It was annihilation designed to make an example, to sear the name of Charles the Bold into the memory of anyone who might consider opposing him. Similarly, the city of Liège, which repeatedly rebelled against Burgundian control, faced his wrath multiple times, culminating in a brutal sack in 1468, where Charles, present in person, ordered the city systematically destroyed. He led his army to crush anyone who opposed him, and civilian lives were often tragically incidental to his strategic aims or his wounded pride. His personal honor code, while perhaps admirable in an abstract chivalric sense, often proved to be his undoing in the practical world of politics and warfare. It seemed to have a clause that read, "Never back down, even if it's clearly a terrible idea, and everyone is politely suggesting a strategic withdrawal to the nearest tavern." This inflexibility made him a predictable and therefore vulnerable opponent for cunning rivals like King Louis V of France, known as the Universal Spider, for the complex webs of diplomacy and intrigue he wove. Louis preferred to defeat his enemies with schemes rather than pitched battles, and he found Charles with his straightforward head-on approach a relatively easy fly to ensnare in his political machinations. Despite the brutal realities of his campaigns, Charles was meticulous about his own image and the splendor of his court even in the field. It's a quirky, almost contradictory aspect of his personality that even when on military expeditions, his camp was a testament to Burgundian wealth and his own princely status. You might picture him surrounded by rich tapestries hanging in his command tent, dining off silver plate, attended by a retinue of courtiers and servants. While his soldiers were probably eating hardtack and whatever they could forage, Charles was likely maintaining a level of ducal luxury. You know, essential battlefield supplies, like a personal wine steward. This commitment to outward display was part of his concept of magnificence, essential to his claim for royal status. His relentless pursuit of power and territory eventually brought him into conflict with the hardy Swiss Confederacy, whose pikemen, were renowned for their discipline and effectiveness. Charles, underestimating their resolve and military prowess, launched a series of invasions. The results were disastrous for Burgundy. He suffered humiliating defeats at Grandson and Morat in 1476, where his splendid army was routed and his treasure and artillery captured. Yet true to his epithet, the bold, or the rash, Charles refused to accept defeat or adjust his ambitions. This leads us to his final fateful stand. In the freezing winter of 1477, he laid siege to the city of Nancy in Lorraine, determined to reclaim it. His advisors urged caution, pointing to the harsh weather, his depleted forces, and the approaching relief army. But Charles, driven by his indomitable will and that ever-present obsession with honor, would not yield. The Battle of Nancy, fought on January 5th, 1477, was a catastrophe for the Burgundians. Charles, fighting personally in the thick of the battle as always, was killed. His body, stripped and mutilated, was found days later frozen in a stream identifiable only by old battle scars, and some say his long fingernails. The death of Charles the Bold was a pivotal moment in European history, a mainstream historical fact with far-reaching consequences. With no male heir, his vast Burgundian lands became the subject of intense dispute. Much of it was absorbed by France, while the remainder through the marriage of his daughter, Mary of Burgundy, to Maximilian of Habsburg, passed into the control of the Habsburg dynasty, shaping European power politics for centuries to come. The dream of a Burgundian kingdom died with Charles in that icy ditch. Historians still argue whether Charles the Bold's epithet, le téméraire, truly captures his strategic thinking, or if his ambitious military campaigns were less reckless folly and more a calculated, albeit ultimately unsuccessful bid for supreme power in a volatile political landscape. Was he a magnificent prince, a true knight defending his honor and striving for a rightful crown? Or was he a stubborn, arrogant warlord whose pride and ruthlessness led him and his duchy to ruin? Perhaps he was all of these things, a complex figure, embodying the glorious, yet often brutal contradictions of his age. As you leave the glittering, blood-stained dream of Burgundy behind you, are reminded that immense wealth and cultural brilliance are no guarantee against the destructive power of unchecked ambition. The story of Charles the Bold is a chilling testament to how a single individual's obsession with honor and glory, untempered by pragmatism or mercy, can lead not only to widespread slaughter, but also to their own dramatic downfall, leaving behind a fractured legacy and a warning that echoes through the ages. That echo guides us now, from the shattered dreams of ducal Burgundy to the very heart of a kingdom that was methodically and often mercilessly consolidating its power, France, under the reign of Philip IV. As you step into his realm at the turn of the 14th century, the air feels different. It's less about the flamboyant battlefield honor of a Charles the Bold, and more about a cold, calculating and unyielding assertion of royal authority. This king wasn't known as the Bold or the Rash, but as Philip le Bel, Philip the Fair. A nickname, mind you, that referred strictly to his handsome appearance, not necessarily to his methods of dispute resolution. You probably wouldn't want him mediating your next workplace disagreement. His idea of a fair outcome could be rather final. He was also known perhaps more accurately as the Iron King. Philip's reign from 1285 to 1314 was dedicated to strengthening the French monarchy, centralizing power, and filling the royal coffers, often by any means necessary. And when Philip set his sights on a target, whether it was a wealthy military order, a recalcitrant pope, or even those who had once served him well. His justice was swift, often brutal, and sometimes quite literally fiery. Perhaps the most infamous episode of Philip's reign, and one that resonates with a dark glamour even today, is his systematic destruction of the Knights Templar. Imagine this powerful, wealthy, and once revered military order, the elite fighting force of the Crusades, who had evolved into an international banking institution. The Knights Templar, once the rock stars of the crusading world, found their celebrity status revoked in a rather dramatic and toasty fashion. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, a date that some say contributes to the superstition around Friday the 13th, Philip unleashed a coordinated series of raids across France, arresting thousands of Templars from the Grand Master Jacques de Molay down to humble sergeants. The charges leveled against them were shocking heresy idolatry, specifically accusations of worshipping a head called Baphomet spitting on the cross, and institutionalized sodomy. You are there in the shadows as these men, many of them old warriors, are dragged from their beds, bewildered and afraid. Under horrific torture, administered with chilling bureaucratic efficiency by Philip's agents, many Templars confessed to these crimes. Whether these confessions were genuine or simply the desperate words of men broken by unbearable pain is a question that still haunts their legacy. Philip's motives are a subject of intense historical debate. Was he a genuinely pious king, horrified by the alleged corruption within this powerful religious order? Or was he a pragmatic, perhaps cynical ruler, eyeing the Templars' immense wealth to finance his wars, particularly against England and Flanders, and to pay off the kingdom's substantial debts? Historians still argue whether Philip IV's relentless persecution of the Knights Templar was driven primarily by his genuine belief in their guilt and his pious duty to cleanse the kingdom, or by his desperate need for their immense wealth to consolidate royal authority. The truth, as is often the case, is likely a complex tapestry woven from threads of piety, politics, and pressing financial need. The culmination of this persecution was the public burning of dozens of Templars, including the Grand Master Jacques de Molay and other leaders in Paris in 1314. You can almost feel the heat of the pyre, smell the acrid smoke, and hear the hushed horror of the crowd as these once proud knights met their agonizing end. Legend has it that from the flames, Jacques de Molay cursed Philip IV and Pope Clement V, who had reluctantly acquiesced to Philip's pressure to dissolve the order, summoning them to God's judgment within a year. Whether curse or coincidence, both Philip and Clement were dead before the year was out. But Philip's iron will wasn't just directed at military orders. He famously clashed with Pope Boniface VIII, a pontiff with a very high view of papal authority. When Boniface issued bulls asserting papal supremacy over secular rulers, Philip responded with an audacity that shocked Christendom. He didn't just write angry letters. He sent his agent, Guillaume de Nogaret, to Italy. In 1303, at Anagni, the Pope's hometown, Nogaret, and a band of soldiers stormed the papal palace and, according to some accounts, physically assaulted the elderly Pope. Arresting the Pope wasn't exactly a standard diplomatic maneuver even back then. It's like sending a strongly worded email, but with more actual kidnapping and rough handling involved. Boniface was rescued by locals after a few days, but died shortly thereafter, a broken man. This outrage of Anagni was a stark demonstration of the shifting balance of power, with the French monarchy asserting its dominance even over the papacy. It directly led to the period known as the Avignon Papacy, where subsequent popes resided in Avignon under the considerable influence of the French crown. And what of the chilling phrase, burned his old friends alive? While the Templar leaders certainly fit the bill of prominent figures meeting fiery ends, Philip's ruthlessness extended to anyone who became an obstacle or outlived their usefulness. Even those who had served him faithfully could find themselves on the wrong side of his justice if it suited the king's purposes. The line between trusted advisor and condemned traitor could be perilously thin. Figures like Enguerrand de Marigny, Philip's own chamberlain and finance minister who ably served him for years, found himself accused and executed, though hanged, not burned, and technically after Philip's death, the groundwork for his fall was laid during Philip's reign, due to the animosity he accrued, implementing Philip's unpopular policies. The principle was clear loyalty to Philip was paramount, but even that was no guarantee of safety if the winds of royal favor shifted. His reign was a masterclass in how to make everyone from the highest noble to the lowliest peasant acutely aware of where true power resided. As a quirky yet revealing tidbit about Philip's financial strategies, long before he turned on the Templars, he had already targeted other groups. In 1306, he expelled all Jews from France, seizing their property and assets. He did something similar with Lombard bankers. While often cloaked in religious or legal justifications, these moves were primarily about filling the perpetually hungry royal treasury. It shows a pattern of pragmatic, often brutal fiscal policy. So as you leave, Philip the Fair's France, the scent of smoke still lingering in the air, you take with you the image of a king who was both a nation builder and a chillingly effective tyrant. He forged a stronger, more centralized France, but he did so with a ruthlessness that left a trail of broken vows, betrayed trust, and smoldering pyres. His reign is a stark reminder that the pursuit of order and state power can often come at a terrible human cost. That human cost takes on a different, perhaps more visceral hue as our quiet journey carries us south, away from the calculating chill of Philip's France and into the sun-baked, fiercely contested lands of the Iberian Peninsula. You feel the air grow warmer, drier scented with dust and the distant tang of conflict. Here in the Kingdom of Navarre, nestled in the foothills of the Pyrenees during the late 12th and early 13th centuries, we meet a king whose epithet speaks volumes, Sancho VII, known as El Fuerte, Sancho the Strong. And when they called him Sancho the Strong, they weren't kidding. This wasn't just a flattering title bestowed by a friendly chronicler. By all accounts, Sancho was a man of imposing physical stature. Skeletal remains attributed to him suggest he may have stood over 7 feet tall, a true giant in an age when the average height was considerably shorter. You can just imagine the sheer presence he must have had towering over his court and his enemies alike. You wouldn't want to be stuck behind him at a medieval jousting tournament, that's for sure. Down in front would probably be your last words. His strength was legendary, and it played a crucial role in the brutal, relentless warfare of the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to expand Christian kingdoms southward against the Moorish caliphates of Iberia. Now, with a ruler known for such formidable strength and operating in such a violent era, it's perhaps unsurprising that some truly grim tales have attached themselves to his name. One of the most chilling of these, a detail that paints a particularly stark picture of medieval brutality, is the legend of a skull tower. The story, whispered down through the ages, claims that Sancho, after a significant victory, ordered the decapitation of hundreds of prisoners. But their deaths were not the end of their utility to him. These severed heads were then allegedly used as building materials, meticulously arranged into a gruesome tower to decorate the city gates. A truly macabre piece of architecture. Imagine approaching a Navarrese city under his rule, and the first thing you see is not a welcoming banner, but this silent, leering edifice of bone. Each skull a testament to Sancho's power, a permanent warning to any who might dare challenge him. His preferred method of urban decoration, if these lurid tales are to be believed, wasn't exactly home and garden approved. Honey, I'm thinking skulls for the new gate feature. Very minimalist, very intimidating. While the specific archaeological evidence for such a structure directly commissioned by Sancho VII might be elusive, and folklorists and historians debate whether such gruesome tales are always factual accounts or sometimes symbolic representations of a ruler's fearsome reputation, the very existence of the story speaks to the kind of terror that strong martial kings of this period could inspire. It was an age where psychological warfare was as important as battlefield tactics. And what could be more psychologically devastating than a monument built from the remains of your defeated comrades? Whether the skull tower is literal fact or a potent legend, Sancho's ferocity in battle is well documented. His most celebrated moment, a mainstream historical fact of the Reconquista, came at the pivotal battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. This was a major clash, a grand coalition of Christian kingdoms from Iberia against the Almohad Caliphate. Sancho, by then in his 60s, but still formidable, led his Navarrese knights with extraordinary valor. According to popular accounts, the Almohad Caliph, Muhammad al-Nasir, was protected by an elite bodyguard of slave warriors chained together around his tent. Sancho the Strong, in a display of almost superhuman might and courage, is said to have personally smashed through these chains, or perhaps the palisade they were attached to, paving the way for the Christian knights to break the enemy's center. He probably voided the warranty on the chains, but it definitely made for a great story and a turning point in the battle. The victory at Las Navas de Tolosa was decisive, shattering Almohad power in Iberia and significantly advancing the Reconquista. As a trophy from this battle, Sancho is said to have taken the chains that guarded the caliph's tent and incorporated them into Navarre's coat of arms, where they remain a symbol to this day. A more lasting and certainly less gruesome monument to his strength than any tower of skulls. So you have this image of Sancho, a giant of a man, a fierce warrior, capable of both inspiring incredible loyalty in his troops, and if the legends hold any truth, a chilling ruthlessness towards his enemies. He was a product of his time, a king forged in the crucible of near-constant warfare, where strength and a fearsome reputation were essential tools for survival and rule. In his later years, Sancho's legendary strength began to fail him. He suffered from a long and painful illness, often described as severe varicose ulcers on his leg, which eventually led to his withdrawal from public life. He retired to the castle of Tudela, and it's here that the details become a bit hazy. Historians still argue about the exact nature and severity of the illness that afflicted Sancho VII in his later years, leading to his seclusion, and how it truly impacted his long rule over Navarre, which spanned over 4 decades. He outlived many of his contemporaries, dying in 1234, leaving no legitimate children, which ultimately led to the end of his dynasty, and Navarre passing under French influence for a time. As you leave the dusty plains of Navarre, the image of Sancho the Strong, with his towering frame and his fearsome reputation, lingers. The stories of skull towers whether literally true or not, serve as a stark reminder of the brutal aesthetics of power in a brutal age. It was a time when kings weren't just rulers. They were often symbols, and sometimes those symbols needed to be writ large in stone steel, and allegedly even in bone, to ensure their message of dominance was unmistakably clear. The sun sets over the Pyrenees, and the shadows lengthen, perhaps hiding secrets of battles fought and prisoners taken long, long ago. That unmistakable message of dominance, whether etched in bone or burnished steel, wasn't just a matter of brute force or fearsome reputation. As you continue your quiet journey through these shadowed corridors of power, you begin to sense a deeper, more pervasive undercurrent supporting these blood-soaked thrones. It was an idea potent and almost unshakable in the medieval mind, the notion that kings weren't merely powerful men, but instruments of a higher will, their authority flowing directly from the heavens. You're now stepping into the realm of belief, into the very air that these societies breathed. Think about it. If a king is chosen by God, anointed as his representative on earth, then his decrees carry a weight far beyond mere political or military might. They carry the imprimatur of the divine. This concept, the early stirrings of what would later be more formally articulated as the divine right of kings, was a powerful tool. It transformed a ruler from a mere warlord or administrator into something sacred, something set apart. The anointing ceremony during a king's coronation, a mainstream historical fact, was central to this. You can picture the scene, the solemn rites, the sacred oil, the king kneeling then rising, as not just a ruler, but as one touched by God's grace, likened to the biblical kings of old David or Solomon. This wasn't just pageantry. It was a profound statement of legitimacy. And with this divine backing came a terrifying corollary. If the king acts, it is because God wills it. Deus vult, God wills it, was a phrase most famously associated with the Crusades, but its spirit could easily permeate domestic policy too. So if your king, like Philip the Fair, decided to round up and burn the Knights Templar, accusing them of heresy, it wasn't just a political maneuver or a land grab. It was framed as a holy duty, a cleansing of the kingdom in God's name. If another ruler, perhaps one like Vlad the Impaler, decided that mass executions were necessary to maintain order and defend Christendom, who was to argue that it wasn't part of a divine, if brutal, plan? This celestial endorsement had the convenient effect of making the king's actions, no matter how violent or seemingly unjust, appear righteous, or at least tragically necessary. This leads to an even more potent idea: the king is never wrong. If he is God's chosen, then to question his judgment, to resist his will, is not merely treason against the state. It teeters on the edge of blasphemy against God himself. Imagine the psychological weight of that. Being chosen by God is a pretty sweet gig when you think about it. Imagine never being wrong. Your shopping choices, your haircut, your decision to invade the neighboring duchy because their cheese was clearly inferior, all divinely inspired. It's a recipe for absolute power, and as we know, absolute power, well, it doesn't always bring out the best in people. This belief system could effectively silence dissent and ensure obedience, because the consequences of defiance were not just earthly punishment, but potential divine retribution too. Of course, the church played a complex role in all this. Sometimes, powerful churchmen did try to act as a check on royal excesses, reminding kings of their Christian duties to be just and merciful. But just as often, if not more so, the church and the monarchy were intertwined, each reinforcing the other's authority. Bishops and abbots were often major landowners and political players, and the king as God's anointed, was seen as the protector of the church. It was a symbiotic relationship that for the common person only solidified the impression of an unassailable, divinely ordained power structure. You see the peasant farmer already struggling, looking up at the distant castle and the even more distant cathedral, and feeling very, very small in the grand scheme of things. This divine justification for brutality wasn't always shouted from the rooftops. Sometimes it was an unspoken assumption, a foundational belief that underpinned the entire social order. When King John, for instance, was being particularly awful, the barons who opposed him weren't initially trying to overthrow the concept of divinely sanctioned kingship itself, but rather arguing that John wasn't living up to his sacred obligations as a king. They were in a way appealing to a higher standard of what a God-chosen king should be. And then you have these quirky little manifestations of sacred kingship like the king's touch. For centuries, it was widely believed in England and France that the monarch could cure scrofula, a nasty skin disease, simply by touching the afflicted person. Thousands would line up for this royal touch. Got a nasty rash? Forget the medieval equivalent of WebMD, just queue up for the king's touch. Side effects may include an overwhelming urge to pay your taxes promptly. While it might seem strange to us, this practice powerfully reinforced the idea that the king possessed a special, almost supernatural grace, a healing power derived from his sacred office. But here's where the scholarly debate often arises. Historians still debate the extent to which medieval monarchs genuinely believed in their own divinely ordained authority versus cynically using religious rhetoric as a tool for political control and justification of their actions. Was Philip the Fair truly convinced he was doing God's work when he crushed the Templars? Or was it a cold, hard calculation of power and profit neatly gift-wrapped in piety? Was Charles the Bold's obsession with honor a divinely inspired quest for righteous glory? Or the hubris of a man convinced of his own supreme importance? It's likely a mixture. Humans are very good at convincing themselves that what they want to do aligns perfectly with what a higher power wants them to do. So when you imagine these kings, Vlad with his forests, of the impaled John with his starved prisoners, Charles with his civilian slaughters, Philip with his burning pyres, or even Sancho with his alleged skull towers, remember that their actions often took place within a worldview where such brutality could be, and often was, rationalized as the grim work of God's anointed. If the king decided your village was going to be the site of his new, let's say, giant tap-dancing academy, and it was God's will, you'd better start clearing space and practicing your time steps. No appeals to zoning committees back then. This divine stamp of approval created a chilling space where compassion could be dismissed as weakness, and ruthlessness could be lauded as righteous strength, making the medieval world a particularly precarious place for anyone who wasn't wearing a crown. And for those not wearing a crown, life was indeed precarious, often in the most fundamental ways. While kings and nobles debated divine mandates and plotted grand strategies from their high-backed, velvet-cushioned chairs, the vast majority of the population was engaged in a far more immediate and constant struggle, the simple act of finding enough to eat. As you turn your gaze from the glittering, often blood-stained halls of power, you find yourself standing at the edge of a humble peasant dwelling. The air here is not thick with incense and roasted meats, but with the smell of damp earth wood smoke and something far less appetizing. Let's first peek back for a moment into that royal dining hall, just to fully appreciate the chasm. Imagine the scene: long tables, groaning under the weight of food. The royal banquet wasn't just a meal. It was an Olympic sport in competitive eating and showing off. Oh, you only have one roasted swan, decorated with its own feathers and holding a tiny banner in its beak. How quaint. You see peacocks presented in full plumage, suckling pigs, venison, wild boar, and a dazzling array of game birds. Spices, a mark of extreme wealth, imported from the distant east. Cinnamon cloves, nutmeg, ginger pepper. Perfume the air, masking the less than fresh aroma of some ingredients in an age before refrigeration. There are elaborate sugar sculptures called subtleties, mountains of sweetmeats, and endless flagons of wine and ale. It's a feast for the senses, a display of power and plenty designed to awe and impress. Now, you step away from that dazzling, almost overwhelming scene, and your eyes adjust to the gloom of a peasant's hut. The contrast is jarring. Here, the daily meal is a far cry from roasted swan. The centerpiece of the peasant diet, the thing that kept body and soul vaguely together, was pottage. Imagine a perpetually simmering pot over the small fire, a kind of thick stew or porridge. Into this pot went whatever was available, oats, barley, or rye, thickened with coarsely ground flour. Vegetables from their small garden plot, onions, leeks, cabbages, peas, beans, would be added along with any foraged wild greens or herbs. And when we speak of grass porridge, as some grim accounts might suggest, you can envision the leanest of times when even those meager garden vegetables failed. It means a desperate concoction, perhaps thickened with ground nutshells or tree bark, bulked out with whatever edible weeds or tough grasses could be scavenged from the roadsides or forest edges. This wasn't about culinary delight. It was about staving off the gnawing emptiness in your belly for another day. The peasant's cookbook probably had two recipes: stuff you found today pottage, and slightly different stuff you found today pottage. Maybe a festive edition with extra grit porridge. Bread was the other great staple, but again, a world away from the fine white manchette bread gracing the Lord's table. Yours as a peasant is a heavy dark loaf made from rye or barley, often gritty with particles from the millstone. It's dense, perhaps a little sour, and you eat it with almost every meal if you're lucky enough to have it. Sometimes these coarse loaves known as trenchers would serve a dual purpose. A thick slice of stale bread would be used as a makeshift plate to hold your portion of pottage or any rare piece of meat. After the meal, this gravy-soaked trencher might be eaten by you, given to the even poorer, or tossed to the dogs. Using stale bread as a plate was peak medieval recycling. No washing up, and you could eat your dishes. Though I suspect soggy gravy bread wasn't everyone's idea of dessert. Meat was a rare luxury. The forests teeming with game were often the king's or the lord's exclusive hunting grounds, and poaching carried severe penalties. Remember those royal whims we talked about? If you were fortunate, you might keep a pig, which would be slaughtered in the autumn, its meat carefully salted and smoked to last through the winter. A chicken might provide a few precious eggs, or eventually a small meal. But for the most part, your protein came from peas, beans, and occasionally a bit of cheese or a sip of milk from the family cow if you had one. Fish might be available if you lived near a river or coast, but even fishing rights were often controlled. This diet, so heavily reliant on coarse grains and whatever vegetables could be grown or found, was often monotonous and nutritionally deficient. The why it was horrible isn't just about the lack of flavor or variety. It's about the constant vulnerability. A bad harvest, a drought, or a prolonged war could tip a family from meager subsistence into outright starvation. Malnutrition weakened the immune system, making people, especially children, highly susceptible to diseases that are now easily preventable. You can feel the gnawing anxiety that must have been a constant companion. Will there be enough? Will we make it through the winter? Historians still debate the actual nutritional adequacy of the medieval peasant diet. Some argue it was often severely deficient, leading to chronic ill health, stunted growth, and a short life expectancy. Others suggest that in good years, with a plentiful harvest and access to common lands for foraging, it could provide sufficient, if unexciting, sustenance. But good years were never guaranteed, and the margin for survival was perilously thin. The relentless physical labor demanded by agricultural life required a huge caloric intake, one that the paltry plate often struggled to provide. So as you sit there in the dim light of the peasant's hut, chewing on your hunk of dark bread and contemplating a bowl of thin grayish pottage, the distant laughter from the Lord's feasting hall, or the king's pronouncements of divine will feel a universe away. The grand tapestry of medieval power and glory was woven with the threads of countless lives spent in unceasing toil, often fueled by little more than hope and a very, very humble meal. And that hope, that fragile ember, was tested most severely as the days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the icy grip of winter tightened its hold. The humble meal you barely managed to scrape together in the warmer months became an even more pressing concern when the ground froze hard and the last of the autumn harvest dwindled. You're now huddling deeper into your thin cloak, the wind whistling through the poorly chinked walls of your small dwelling as we face the stark reality of a medieval winter. The first thing that strikes you is the cold, not just a bracing chill, but a deep penetrating cold that seems to seep into your very bones. Your home, likely a 1 or 2 room hut made of wattle and daub with a thatched roof, offers meager protection. A central hearth provides warmth and a place to cook, but the smoke often fills the cramped space before grudgingly finding its way out through a hole in the roof, making your eyes water and your throat raw. Glass windows, a luxury far beyond your reach. Wooden shutters or an animal hide might cover the openings, but the drafts are relentless. Winter evenings were long. With no Netflix and iffy candlelight from a rush dip, or a precious tallow candle, options were limited. Probably a lot of staring at the fire, competitive shivering, or telling stories about how much better food was back in August. Then there's the food, or rather the precariousness of it. Remember, there's no refrigeration, no friendly hum of a freezer in the corner, no popping down to the supermarket if you run out of something. No fridge means your leftovers have a very short and often dramatic shelf life. Is this milk supposed to be chunky and sentient? Was probably a common kitchen question. Surviving the winter depended entirely on what you managed to grow, raise, and preserve during the more bountiful months. Preservation methods were a constant battle against decay. Salting and smoking meat and fish were indeed primary methods for long-term storage, a crucial mainstream historical fact if you were fortunate enough to have any surplus meat from that autumn slaughtered pig or a good catch from the river. Vegetables like cabbages might be pickled if you had access to salt and vinegar, though these too were valuable commodities. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, might be stored in a cool, dark pit or a root cellar dug beneath your hut, hoping to keep them from freezing or rotting too quickly. Grains, the absolute staff of life, had to be kept dry and safe from rats and mice a never-ending challenge. But these methods were far from foolproof. Dampness was a constant enemy. Molds and fungi thrived in the cool, moist conditions. That loaf of dark bread, so precious, might start to develop its own furry green or blue ecosystem in the corner. That's not a forgotten science experiment. That's potentially February's breakfast. You'd scrape off the worst bits, perhaps toast it heavily over the fire if you had enough fuel, and try to ignore the musty taste, hoping it wouldn't make you sick. Eating moldy food wasn't a choice. It was often a grim necessity when the alternative was an empty belly. Extra penicillin, perhaps, but not the kind that came with a doctor's prescription. As winter wore on, the carefully hoarded supplies would inevitably dwindle. You can feel the anxiety rising with each scoop of grain taken from the storage bin, each salted fish unwrapped. The period in late winter and early spring before the first new crops could be harvested was often known as the hunger gap or the starving time. This was when the stores were at their lowest and the threat of starvation loomed largest. People grew gaunt, their resistance to illness plummeting. Fuel was another constant concern. Keeping that meager fire going required a steady supply of wood. If you didn't have your own woodlot, you'd spend precious daylight hours short as they were foraging for fallen branches in the Lord's forest, always risking penalties for taking more than was permitted. Every piece of firewood represented arduous labor, often carried for long distances on your back. The darkness itself was oppressive. With daylight hours short and artificial light sources expensive and inefficient, much of life was lived in gloom or near darkness. This, combined with the cold and hunger, undoubtedly took a toll on people's spirits. Yet it was also a time when communities might draw closer. Families would huddle together for warmth, sharing stories, mending tools, or spinning wool by the faint light of the fire. Survival often depended on mutual support within the village, though harsh conditions could also lead to suspicion and conflict over scarce resources. Interestingly, one quirky tidbit from this era is the origin of the curfew. The word comes from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. A bell would ring in the evening, signaling that all household fires should be banked or covered with a special lid. This wasn't just about saving fuel. It was a critical fire safety measure in villages and towns where houses were built close together, largely of wood and thatch, and a stray spark could lead to a devastating conflagration, especially when fires were kept burning longer in the winter. Archaeologists and historians continue to debate the effectiveness and widespread use of various food storage techniques by medieval peasants, particularly the design and efficiency of those underground pits for preserving grain and other staples against damp frost and pests. Success rates likely varied wildly depending on soil conditions, skill, and a good dose of luck. So you endure. You make the pottage thinner, the bread ration smaller. You tell yourself that spring will come. The survival logic wasn't about elaborate plans. It was about resilience, born of grim necessity, about making do with what little you had, about facing each frozen dawn with the determination to see another one. It's a quiet, desperate fight, fought in countless humble dwellings, far from the grand narratives of kings and battles, but no less crucial to the story of the past. The wind howls outside a mournful sound, and you pull your threadbare blanket tighter, listening to the gnawing emptiness inside. That gnawing emptiness, a hollow ache in the pit of your stomach, becomes an almost constant companion as winter drags on into the lean months of early spring. The threadbare blanket does little to warm you when the chill comes from within, from a body starved of fuel. You're now deep in the heart of that hunger gap. We spoke of a time when the last of the stored food is running out, and the promise of the new harvest feels a lifetime away. And it's in these desperate moments that you encounter the stark reality of survival, perhaps best symbolized by the humble and often uncooked turnip. Why raw? You wonder as you clutch the cold, earthy globe in your hand. Perhaps the small store of firewood is nearly exhausted, reserved for the bitterest nights, or for boiling the occasional handful of questionable weeds. Perhaps there's simply nothing else to eat with it. No scrap of salted pork or spoonful of pottage to justify the effort of cooking. Or perhaps, in the depths of your weariness, the energy required to build up the fire and wait for the turnip to soften just seems too much. So you bite into it. The flesh is hard, fibrous, and your teeth struggle to tear through it. The taste is earthy, with a sharp, sometimes bitter tang that makes your jaw ache. It's not pleasant. It's not satisfying. But it's something. Your Michelin star meal for today. A raw turnip, side of existential dread. At least it's crunchy and locally sourced, probably from that patch of dirt you call a garden, if you were lucky enough to have one produce anything that lasted this long. The raw turnip isn't a delicacy. It's a testament to the sheer, grinding desperation of constant hunger. This isn't the hunger you feel after missing lunch because you were busy. This is a deep, pervasive hunger that colors every thought, every action. It's a hunger that makes your limbs feel heavy, your mind dull. It's the hunger that forces you to look at the natural world not with appreciation for its beauty, but with a desperate, calculating eye. What here can I possibly eat? You might find yourself boiling nettles, carefully avoiding their sting to create a thin, unappetizing soup. Acorns, normally too bitter and astringent for human consumption, due to tannins, might be laboriously leached in running water, then ground into a coarse meal to extend your dwindling flour supply. Tree bark, particularly the intercambium layer of certain trees, could be stripped and eaten, though it offered little more than woody fiber and a fleeting sensation of fullness. Remember that grass porridge we mentioned. In these dire times, it's a very real possibility, a desperate attempt to extract some form of sustenance from whatever hardy greens or even actual grasses might be showing their first stubborn shoots. Foraging was like a medieval extreme reality show, Survivor the Backyard. Find enough edible weeds and bitter acorns to see another sunrise, or it's game over. No immunity idols here. The constant hunger takes a visible toll. You see it in the hollows of your own cheeks, reflected in a murky puddle in the listlessness of your children. Their small bodies, already vulnerable, are hit hardest. Their growth is stunted, their laughter infrequent. The whimpers of a hungry child in the dead of night. That's a sound that would etch itself into your soul, a constant reminder of your inability to provide even the most basic necessity. This relentless deprivation wasn't just a physical state, it was a psychological one. Food, or the lack of it, would dominate your thoughts. Dreams would be filled with impossible feasts. Waking hours would be consumed by the search for the next meager mouthful. The world shrinks down to the size of your empty stomach. That grumbling in your belly isn't just hunger. It's your internal monologue, loudly suggesting that maybe, just maybe, rocks could be edible if you squint hard enough. Spoiler, they're not. In such extreme circumstances, social norms could fray. While communities often pulled together desperation could also breed suspicion and conflict. The theft of a hoarded turnip or a handful of grain could become a major crime with dire consequences. Begging, once perhaps reserved for the infirm or widowed, might become a more common sight as families exhausted their last reserves. The mainstream historical fact is that peasants often relied heavily on foraging for wild foods, especially during these lean times. But the bounty of the wild was often seasonal and insufficient to ward off severe hunger or widespread malnutrition during prolonged famines or particularly harsh winters. Even access to the scraps was regulated. A quirky yet telling aspect of medieval rural life was the practice of gleaning. This was the customary right of the poor, often women and children, to go into the fields after the harvest was complete and gather any leftover ears of grain that the reapers had missed. It institutionalized the act of scavenging, a clear acknowledgement that many lived on the very edge of starvation, dependent on the literal crumbs from the agricultural table. Historians and paleopathologists continue to analyze skeletal remains from medieval burial sites to determine the precise impact of chronic malnutrition and famine on these peasant populations. They look for telltale signs like Harris lines in bones indicating periods of arrested growth or enamel hypoplasia, on teeth debating the frequency and severity of these hunger episodes across different regions and throughout the centuries of the Middle Ages. The bones themselves tell a silent story of hardship. So as you finish your raw turnip, the gritty texture still in your mouth, you understand that for many in the Middle Ages, life was not a grand adventure of knights and castles, but a relentless, often losing battle against an empty stomach. The specter of hunger was a constant, unwelcome guest at the peasant's table, a grim reality far removed from the divinely ordained feasts of the kings we met earlier. It's a quiet, persistent suffering that formed the bleak backdrop to so many lives. And that vast distance between the king's divinely ordained feast and your grim, earthy reality wasn't just a matter of social standing. It was a chasm actively widened by the very whims and ambitions of those rulers. The hunger you feel the raw turnip in your hand isn't always just a consequence of a bad harvest or a harsh winter. Often, it's a direct result of decisions made far away in a world of power you can barely imagine by a king who likely never had to wonder where his next meal was coming from. Think back to the kings we've encountered on our quiet stroll. When a ruler, like Charles the Bold, decided his ducal honor demanded yet another military campaign to expand his territories, or when King John of England was determined to reclaim his lost lands in France. Who do you think bore the brunt of these ambitions? It was you, the peasant, the farmer, the backbone of the kingdom. Your sons might be conscripted, plucked from the fields, where their labor was desperately needed, leaving fewer hands to tend the crops. In the armies themselves, they had to eat. Having the king's army pass through your village was like a visit from a very hungry, very destructive swarm of locusts, but with more armor and a tendency to borrow your chickens permanently. This practice, known as purveyance, was a mainstream historical fact. It was the crown's right to requisition food, lodging, and transport from its subjects, often with little or delayed compensation. Imagine your carefully hoarded sacks of grain, your only pig your ox needed for plowing, all taken to feed soldiers on their way to a war you didn't start and likely didn't understand. Then there was taxation. Kings needed money. They needed it for those wars, for building grand castles, like the ones we've imagined, for maintaining their lavish courts, and sometimes, let's be honest, just because they wanted it. Philip IV of France, the Iron King, was a master of ingenious and often crushing taxation to fund his state-building and military ventures. These taxes weren't just on land. They could be on goods sold at market on salt, the infamous gabelle in France, or levied as special aids for particular royal needs. Often, these taxes had to be paid in kind, a portion of your grain, a number of your livestock. Each tax collector's visit meant a further depletion of your already meager stores, pushing you closer to that raw turnip reality. The king needs a new summer castle with gold-plated gargoyles. Well, there goes your village's entire turnip harvest for the next 5 years. Hope you like the taste of patriotic sacrifice. And what about the land itself? Large swathes of forest, which could have provided vital resources, were often declared royal preserves, solely for the king's hunting pleasure. You might see deer boar and other game roaming plentifully within those woods, a tantalizing source of protein. But to hunt them was to risk severe punishment. That juicy-looking deer in the king's forest, admire it from afar. Trying to turn it into dinner could result in you becoming an involuntary participant in a public service announcement about the importance of not touching the king's venison, usually involving fewer limbs than you started with. Even gathering firewood or foraging for wild plants in these restricted areas could be forbidden, further limiting your ability to survive. Your world, already small, was hemmed in by royal decree. Sometimes, a king's whim could alter your life even more directly. A grant of land to a favored noble or to a monastery might mean your village suddenly had a new lord, with new demands and new interpretations of customary rights. Land could be enclosed for sheep farming, which was often more profitable for landowners than traditional agriculture, displacing families who had worked that soil for generations. The king's crumbs, indeed. You were left to scramble for whatever was left, after the powerful had taken their fill and their appetites were often insatiable. Even when kings weren't actively being brutal, their neglect or incompetence could be just as devastating. A ruler focused solely on foreign wars or internal power struggles might ignore vital infrastructure like roads, bridges, or dikes, essential for agriculture and trade. Lawlessness could flourish under a weak or distracted king, leaving peasant communities vulnerable to bandits or feuding nobles, further disrupting the fragile cycle of food production. It's not just the physical taking of food, it's the crushing weight of uncertainty. How can you plan for the future store for the winter when you live under a ruler whose unpredictable rages, sudden new taxes, or reckless military adventures could sweep away everything you have in an instant? This constant insecurity, this knowledge that your livelihood and your very survival were subject to the whims of a distant, all-powerful figure, must have been an immense psychological burden. A quirky, yet telling illustration of how deeply class and royal decree permeated even what people consumed comes from sumptuary laws. These were regulations that dictated what different social classes could wear, and sometimes even what they were allowed to eat. For example, certain fine furs, specific colors of cloth, or particular delicacies might be legally reserved only for the nobility. While often intended to curb the perceived extravagance of the rising merchant classes and reinforce the existing social hierarchy, they also served as a constant reminder that the best of everything, including food, was reserved for those at the top by order of the king. Historians continue to debate the degree to which peasant uprisings in the Middle Ages, and there were many, though often brutally suppressed, were primarily driven by specific royal exactions and food shortages versus broader underlying social and economic discontents. But it's hard to imagine that the gnawing hunger exacerbated by a king's demands didn't play a significant role in fueling the desperation that led people to risk everything in revolt. So, as you sit with your meager meal, you understand that the shadow of the king falls not just on the battlefield or in the council chamber, but right here in your humble dwelling, influencing the very quality and quantity of the food, or lack thereof, on your plate. The brutal whims of history's most notorious kings weren't just abstract events. They had a direct, often devastating impact on the daily bread or raw turnip of ordinary people. And that daily turnip, that symbol of making do, often represented the peak of your forethought, not a failure of it. Because when we look from our comfortable future at the medieval peasant struggle, it's easy to wonder about the why. Why the seemingly constant vulnerability? Why the apparent lack of robust food storage, or what might strike us as basic survival logic? You're standing now in the heart of that question, feeling the damp chill of a poorly protected food cache, the gnawing uncertainty of it all. Let's talk about storage, or, more accurately, the heartbreaking lack of it for many. We've touched on the absence of refrigeration, that magical cold box we take for granted. Without it, everything perishable is on a ticking clock. But even for less perishable items like grain, the challenges were immense. Your typical peasant dwelling, often constructed with wattle and daub, a framework of woven twigs packed with clay mud and straw, was a masterpiece of using available materials. It was, however, not exactly Fort Knox against the elements or pests. This quirky tidbit of medieval architecture meant that walls were often damp, roofs could leak, and the earthen floors did little to deter unwelcome guests. Your pantry wasn't just a pantry. It was a bustling metropolis for rats, mice, and weevils. They probably had tiny little mayoral elections in your grain sack. And they always won feasting on the very food meant to see your family through the winter. You might try to store your precious grain in earthenware pots, wooden chests, or pits dug into the floor, perhaps lined with clay or straw. But these offered limited protection. Damp could seep in, causing mold to flourish. Remember that moldy bread, insects could burrow and breed. A significant portion of any harvest could be lost in storage, a truly devastating blow when you were already living on the margins. Large, well-built communal granaries were more often the domain of the lord or the monastery, storing the tithes and rents collected from you, not necessarily securing your personal supply. And even if you managed against all odds to put aside a small surplus, how secure was it really? We've seen how royal purveyance or sudden taxes could empty your stores. A desperate neighbor, or outright bandits in times of unrest, might also see your meager reserve as an opportunity. Keeping a substantial food hoard, even if you could create one, could ironically make you more of a target. Now about that seeming absence of survival logic. From our vantage point, surrounded by scientific knowledge and technological solutions, it's tempting to think, why didn't they just do X, Y, or Z to improve their situation? Someone from the 21st century might say, why didn't they just build a hermetically sealed solar-powered grain silo with automated pest control? To which the medieval peasant, after a long, bewildered silence, might reply, what's a solo-powered what now? And can I eat it before the Lord taxes it, or the king's army requisitions the donkey? I'd need to haul the materials. The survival logic of the medieval peasant was forged in the crucible of their reality, not ours. Their decisions were often based on mitigating immediate risk, rather than long-term ambitious planning. Innovation is a luxury when failure means starvation for your family. Tried and tested methods, passed down through generations, even if inefficient by our standards, were often seen as the safest bet. Medieval peasant agriculture was heavily dependent on unpredictable weather patterns. A mainstream historical fact is that a single bad harvest due to drought flood or widespread crop disease could trigger a devastating famine, as moving bulk food supplies across long distances to alleviate regional shortages was incredibly difficult and expensive. This bred a certain pragmatism, a focus on the here and now. Then there's the no hope aspect. This isn't to say people lived in constant abject despair, devoid of joy or celebration, but the opportunities for significant betterment, for breaking out of the cycle of toil and scarcity, were incredibly limited. You were likely born into your station in life, and you would likely die in it. This societal rigidity, combined with the seemingly endless cycle of hard labor for meager returns, could foster a sense of fatalism. If life's hardships were seen as God's will, as we discussed earlier, or simply the unchangeable order of things, then striving for radical change might seem pointless, even impious. Anthropologists and historians debate the extent to which this medieval peasant fatalism was a genuine, deeply ingrained acceptance of their lot versus a pragmatic coping mechanism developed in the face of overwhelming and largely uncontrollable socioeconomic and environmental pressures. The long-term forecast for a medieval peasant, if delivered by a brutally honest meteorologist of fate, was often more toil followed by a chance of plague with a light sprinkling of existential despair. Not exactly something you'd see on a motivational poster. This wasn't a lack of intelligence or ingenuity. It was a realistic assessment of the odds stacked against them. The brutal kings we've discussed were a part of that stacked deck. Their wars destroyed crops and diverted labor. Their taxes consumed surpluses, and their general disregard for the welfare of the common folk made any attempt at building a secure future an exercise in futility. Why meticulously save and plan when it could all be wiped out by a royal decree or a rampaging army? So as you observe the peasant struggling with a leaky roof that threatens their grain, or resigning themselves to another meal of watery pottage, you see not an absence of logic, but a logic shaped by almost unimaginable constraints. Their survival was a testament to incredible resilience, to a deep traditional knowledge of their environment, and to an ability to endure hardships that would break most of us today. The hope they clung to was perhaps smaller, more immediate enough food for today's health, for their children, the eventual arrival of spring. It was a hope born not of grand ambitions, but of the simple, powerful human will to keep going one raw turnip at a time. And as you watch that peasant fueled by that small, stubborn hope and that single raw turnip, you begin to see the intricate, often invisible threads that bind their fate to the glittering spectacle of royal power. It's time to step back a little to gaze upon the grand medieval tapestry, not just from the perspective of the individual threads, but to see the whole picture. A design where the brilliance of the few is so often woven with the darker, coarser yarn of common suffering. You've walked through the imposing halls of power, witnessed the chilling resolve of Vlad the Impaler, felt the grasping greed of King John, marched with the honor-obsessed Charles the Bold, shivered at Philip the Fair's fiery justice, and perhaps even glimpsed Sancho the Strong's grim battlefield charisma. Each of these rulers in their own way embodied royalty, power, glory. But now, having also sat in the smoky hut of the peasant, having felt the pang of their hunger and the bite of their winter, you must ask, what was the price of that royal magnificence? The answer, whispered on the wind that rustles through those imaginary blood-soaked thrones, is that it was built almost stone by stone, meal by meal, upon the unending toil, and often the outright terror of the common people. That magnificent castle on the hill, a symbol of royal power, and a great spot for taking selfies if they'd had smartphones, built with peasant sweat, peasant taxes, and probably a fair few peasant accidental tumbles from scaffolding. OSHA was not a big thing back then, you can be sure. The feudal system, the very bedrock of medieval society, was a mainstream historical fact that essentially formalized this pyramid of extraction. At its base, you the peasant owed labor dues and loyalty to your lord, who in turn owed service to a higher noble, and so on up to the king. Wealth, in the form of food resources and human effort, flowed upwards, consolidating in the hands of the elite. The king's glorious new crown, perhaps studded with jewels the size of pigeon eggs, funded by the voluntary turnip contribution fund, to which you voluntarily contributed all your turnips, and your hopes, and your dreams. The lavish feasts we imagined with their roasted swans and spiced wines were only possible because thousands of peasants like you were producing a surplus that was then systematically drawn away from them. The glory that kings sought, often found on the battlefield, came at a tremendous cost to the populace, whose lands became those battlefields, whose sons became the anonymous casualties, and whose meager harvests were requisitioned to feed the warring armies. Terror, too, was a fundamental tool in maintaining this structure. The brutal punishments meted out by some of these kings weren't just isolated acts of sadism. They were public spectacles designed to enforce obedience and discourage rebellion. When Vlad impaled his enemies, or Philip burned the Templars, or Sancho allegedly built his Tower of Skulls, the message was clear. This is the fate of those who defy royal authority. This ever-present threat, this simmering fear, ensured that the system, however unjust it might seem to us, remained largely intact. It's much harder to protest your starvation when the consequence might be a very public and agonizing death. Consider the grand narratives of history, at least as they used to be commonly told. They were often a VIP party guest list, mostly kings, queens, dukes, and the occasional archbishop. The peasants, the vast majority of the population, were the ones working behind the scenes, tilling the fields, tending the livestock, perhaps washing the royal dishes in the back, all while hoping not to get noticed, or worse, blamed for a missing silver spoon. Their lives, their struggles, their contributions were often rendered invisible, mere footnotes in the sagas of great men and their great deeds. Yet it was their labor that fueled the entire medieval economy. It was their resilience that allowed society to continue through famine, plague, and war. The power and glory of the medieval king was not self-generated. It was a reflection, often a distorted and aggrandized one, of the collective resources of the kingdom, resources drawn disproportionately from its humblest members. Even the chivalrous displays of the nobility-like tournaments could come at a cost to the commoner. These mock battles, a quirky tidbit of aristocratic life, were grand spectacles of martial skill and pageantry. But sometimes these elaborate war games, with hundreds of knights and their retinues, could spill out from the designated tournament grounds onto cultivated peasant lands, trampling precious crops, damaging fences, and disrupting the agricultural cycle, all for the sake of sport and noble prestige. Your carefully tended field of barley could become an impromptu jousting lane, and there wasn't much you could do about it. This isn't to say that all rulers were equally brutal, or that there were no moments of justice or charity. But the system itself was inherently weighted against the common person. And when a king with a predisposition towards cruelty or sociopathy, as mentioned in our chilling opening, ascended the throne, this system provided few effective checks on their power to inflict suffering. Their personal failings became magnified, their capacity for harm amplified by the very structure that was supposed to uphold order. Social historians continue to debate the extent to which common people in the Middle Ages passively accepted their lot within the feudal hierarchy versus engaging in various forms of everyday resistance, from foot dragging and petty theft to more organized though often ill-fated uprisings. But regardless of their individual responses, the collective weight of their unrewarded labor and their silent suffering formed the unseen foundation upon which the towering edifice of medieval royalty was constructed. So, as you reflect on this era, remember that the gleam of the crown often casts a long, dark shadow. The power was real, the glory sometimes dazzling, but the price was invariably paid, often in hunger and fear, by the countless anonymous souls whose lives were deemed expendable in the grand, brutal theater of medieval kingship. And that fear, that constant companion to hunger, wasn't just a fleeting emotion experienced during moments of acute crisis. It was for many the very air they breathed, the bitter seasoning in their already meager daily bread. As you delve deeper into the medieval peasant's world, you begin to realize that the brutality of kings didn't just strip away food and resources. It gnawed at the mind, shaping the very way people thought, felt, and interacted with the world around them. Imagine living with a constant low hum of anxiety. It's there when you wake in the morning, wondering if today will bring a new tax, a new royal decree, or the arrival of soldiers with empty bellies and sharp swords. It's there when you speak, even within the supposed safety of your own family, a tiny voice reminding you that walls have ears and a careless word could bring ruin. The medieval peasant's motto might well have been, "Beige is the new black. Blend in. Don't make eye contact with the king's men. Definitely don't win the most likely to question authority award in your village." This wasn't cowardice. It was a deeply ingrained survival strategy. The specific brand of terror wielded by the rulers we've met would have colored this fear in different shades. If you lived in Vlad the Impaler's Wallachia, the sight of a distant stake, or even the rumor of one, might be enough to ensure absolute trembling obedience. Under a king like John, known for his vindictiveness and use of hostages, you'd live in dread of any personal slight or falling into royal debt, knowing your loved ones could pay the price. In Philip the Fair's France, the fear might have been more insidious. The fear of accusation, of being caught in the cogs of his efficient, implacable justice machine, where heresy or treason could be manufactured to suit the crown's needs. And under a warlike duke like Charles the Bold, the fear was of sudden, overwhelming violence, your village becoming a casualty in his relentless pursuit of honor and territory. This constant awareness of potential royal wrath inevitably shaped your interactions, trusting your neighbor not to report you for, say, looking suspiciously well-fed during a famine, or for grumbling about the latest tax, was a big ask when the king's spy network, or simply opportunistic informers, could have better coverage than a modern cell phone provider in a remote area. This erosion of trust could extend even to official forms of justice, while the elaborate ordeal, a quirky earlier medieval method of trial, where guilt or innocence was supposedly revealed by divine intervention through surviving tests like holding a red-hot iron or being immersed in water, was declining by the time of many of our later kings. Its legacy lingered. It underscored a justice system that often felt arbitrary, where your fate could be decided by seemingly random chance or inscrutable divine will, further fueling a sense of powerlessness and anxiety before authority. So how did people cope with this daily bread of brutality and uncertainty? Resignation and a degree of fatalism, as we've touched upon, were certainly common. If your suffering is perceived as part of God's inscrutable plan, or simply the way the world is, then enduring it quietly might seem the only option. But human beings are resilient. Dark humor, often found in folk tales or hushed jokes, can be a powerful way to process the unbearable. When life gives you a sociopathic king and a permanent turnip diet, you make very dark jokes, or possibly a strongly worded folk song that gets you promptly arrested. High-stakes comedy indeed. Intensified religious piety could offer solace, a promise of justice and reward in the afterlife, even if earthly existence was bleak. Conversely, for some, the relentless injustice might have fostered a deep cynicism, a quiet questioning of the very foundations of the world they inhabited. And then there were the more public displays of psychological control. The mainstream historical fact of public executions, hangings, beheadings, burnings, the subsequent display of bodies and gibbets, or heads on spikes at city gates, served as a constant gruesome reminder of the state's power and the consequences of transgression. You couldn't avoid seeing it, smelling it. It became part of the grim wallpaper of life, intended to sear a message of obedience into the collective consciousness. Psychohistorians and cultural historians debate how medieval people processed and internalized this endemic violence and insecurity. Did they become desensitized, viewing such brutality as a normal part of life? Or did they suffer from collective traumas, the medieval equivalent of PTSD, whose symptoms were perhaps expressed in ways we don't fully understand today? It's a complex question, as the human mind has remarkable, if sometimes costly, ways of adapting. What is certain is that this psychological stress would have compounded the physical hardships. A body already weakened by chronic malnutrition and backbreaking labor is far less equipped to handle the constant drip feed of anxiety, the cortisol spikes from sudden alarms, or the pervasive sense of insecurity. The grim daily struggle for existence wasn't just about finding enough calories to keep going. It was about finding the mental fortitude to face another day in a world where your life could be upended by the whim of a distant, powerful, and potentially brutal ruler. The psychological scars, though invisible to us now, were as much a part of the medieval peasant's burden as the calluses on their hands or the hunger in their bellies. It was a world where the mind, as much as the body, was under siege. And as that siege on the medieval mind slowly lifts, as the oppressive weight of constant fear and uncertainty begins to recede from your thoughts, you find yourself gently drifting away from those shadowed lands. The rough-hewn walls of the peasant's hut, the cold stone of the king's fortress, they begin to fade. You're returning now to a world that those beleaguered souls could scarcely have imagined, a world where for many of us the daily bread is not quite so bitter. As you float back towards your own time, towards your own bed, take a moment to consider the quiet hum of the modern world around you. Perhaps it's the gentle whir of a fan, the distant sound of traffic, or just the peaceful silence of your room. Contrast that with the medieval night, the scratch of rats in the thatch, the cry of a hungry child, the ominous clang of a distant church bell signaling curfew, or perhaps more chillingly, an alarm. Medieval bedtime prep often involved checking for those rats, saying a fervent prayer that the leaky roof wouldn't drip directly onto your face, and hoping you wouldn't be abruptly awakened by a Viking raid, a house fire, or a surprise tax audit conducted by the king's rather persuasive enforcers. It's a slightly different wind-down routine from your scrolling through social media for one last cat video ritual, isn't it? Think of the simple comforts. The clean water that flows from your tap, hot or cold, on demand. The light that banishes darkness at the flick of a switch. The food in your refrigerator. That magical box that keeps things fresh, staving off the mold and decay that were constant adversaries for our medieval ancestors. The very concept of comfort, a quirky but profound aspect of our lives, has evolved so dramatically. What we deem basic necessities, a soft mattress, central heating, a private bathroom, effective painkillers, would have been luxuries beyond the wildest dreams of even many medieval nobles, let alone the peasant subsisting on raw turnips. A medieval king, for all his power, might well envy your cozy duvet and memory foam pillow. And what of those kings we've met? Vlad the Impaler with his forests of steaks, King John starving his hostages, Charles the Bold leading his armies to slaughter, Philip the Fair with his fiery purges, Sancho the Strong and his alleged skull towers. Their reigns, steeped in what often appears to be full-blown sociopathy, were made possible by systems that concentrated immense power, with few checks and balances often justified by divine will. The development of modern human rights concepts, the idea that every individual possesses inherent dignity and rights that no ruler can arbitrarily take away, as enshrined in documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is a relatively recent mainstream historical fact. It stands as a stark and thankfully widespread rebuttal to the accepted norms of much medieval governance. Next time you find yourself mildly annoyed that your favorite brand of coffee is out of stock, or the Wi-Fi is buffering during a crucial plot twist in your favorite show, just take a breath. Remember, at least your local mayor isn't threatening to impale you because their prize-winning poodle has an upset stomach. Perspective, as they say, is everything. The ability to voice your complaints, to expect a certain level of justice and accountability from those in power, to live without the constant gnawing fear of arbitrary violence. These are precious inheritances from centuries of struggle and progress. This isn't to say that brutality and suffering have been entirely banished from the world, of course. That would be a naive and dangerous assumption. But the systemic nature of the brutality we've explored tonight, the kind of power wielded by a medieval king, who could quite literally build his architectural statements from human bones, is for many of us a thing of the past. Historians and philosophers continue to debate whether humanity is on a clear trajectory of moral progress, with the decline of such overtly brutal forms of governance serving as evidence, or whether new, perhaps more insidious forms of systemic cruelty and control have simply replaced older ones. It's a question worth pondering, perhaps, in the daylight hours. But for tonight, the purpose of our quiet stroll through these blood-soaked thrones wasn't to leave you unsettled, but to foster a deeper appreciation for the peace and security many of us now enjoy. It's to recognize how far we've come and to remember the silent, unrecorded suffering of those who laid the groundwork, often unknowingly, for a world they would never see. As you snuggle into your non-moldy, non-steak adjacent bed tonight, give an extra sigh of contentment. You've earned it just by being born in a century with reasonably reliable plumbing and significantly fewer public displays of decapitated heads. The shadows of those ancient kings are long their stories, a chilling reminder of power unchecked. But they are shadows of the past. Your room is safe, your door is locked, and the only decrees you need to worry about are perhaps those of your alarm clock in the morning. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, be thankful you don't live under a medieval king, especially one who liked architecture made of bones. Let the darkness outside your window be just that. Darkness, not a cloak, for terrors unimagined. The journey through those harsh and unforgiving medieval nights under the gaze of kings whose names still echo with a certain chilling authority has been a long one. But now, the flickering torchlight of that distant past begins to dim, its harsh edges softening as you return fully to the gentle quiet of your own peaceful surroundings. The scent of wood smoke and fear fades, replaced by the familiar, comforting aroma of your own space, your own time. Allow your mind to let go of those stark images of hardship, the raw turnips and the moldy bread, the chilling decrees and the ever-present threat of violence. They belong to a world that, for all its echoes in our history books and our imaginations, is far removed from the sanctuary of your bed. The struggles of those distant lives, the weight of their fears, can now recede, leaving behind perhaps a quiet sense of gratitude for the simple, profound blessings of your own existence, the warmth of your blankets, the security of your home, the expectation of a peaceful morrow. Let your breathing slow, becoming as soft and regular as the gentle pulse of the sleeping world outside your window. Feel the tension release from your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. You are safe, you are comfortable, and you are on the cusp of a restful sleep. The stories have been told, the journey through the night is ending, and a period of quiet repose awaits you. May your dreams be untroubled by iron kings or shadowed forests, and may you awaken refreshed in the calm light of a new day, carrying only the faintest, most peaceful whisper of history's deep and distant slumber. Sweet dreams.